Chapter 18. We had asked one of the attendants to call us at the first sign of daybreak, and almost before I knew it, there came a rap at the door. We all bounded out of bed, so eager were we to see the first break of day from our lofty perch. We were dressed in no time and went rushing out on the roof like three eager schoolboys. In fact, the noises we made so startled the attendants that they rushed up to see if we were really in our right minds. I suspect the noise the three of us made was more noise than had ever disturbed the peaceful quiet of the old temple since the days it was built, and this we learned was more than 10,000 years ago. In fact, it was so old that it looked a part of the rock upon which it rested. When we arrived on the roof, there was no need to ask for quiet. One look, and my two associates' eyes and mouths went wide open. I suspect, had anyone looked at mine, they would have seen the same. I waited for them to speak. Almost in one breath came the exclamation, "Why, we are surely suspended in mid-air!" They said the sensation was exactly like that I had experienced in the other temple. They had forgotten for a moment that there was anything underneath the feet, and the sensation was that they were floating in midair. One remarked, "I do not wonder that these men can fly after experiencing this." We were aroused from our reveries by a laugh, and all turned to find Emile, Jess, and our friend of the records standing close behind us. One of our associates walked quickly up to them, tried to grasp all of their hands at once, and said, "This is wonderful. We do not wonder you are able to fly after you have been here for a time." They smiled, and one said, "You are as free to fly as we. You only need to know that you have the power within to do so. Then use the power." We then turned to the outlook. The fog had lowered and was floating in the great billowy waves, just high enough so that not a foot of land could be seen anywhere, and the movement of the banks of fog all around gave the sensation that we were being carried on noiseless wings along with the fog. Standing there looking far out, one lost sense of anything underfoot, and it was very difficult to believe that we were not floating in space. As I looked out, it seemed as if my body lost all sense of weight and I was actually floating above the roof. I had so far forgotten myself that when one of the party spoke, my feet hit the roof with such force that I felt the effects of the jar for several days after. At breakfast that morning, we decided to stay over for 3 days, as we expected to visit only one other place of interest before going on to the appointed meeting place. Upon reading the messages Emile had brought, we learned that our chief's party had visited this temple only 3 days before. After breakfast, we went out and found the fog gradually clearing. We watched it until it cleared entirely and the sun came up. We could see the little village nestling close and under the cliff, and the valley far below. Our friends decided to visit the village, and we asked if we might go with them. They laughed and said we could, but they thought we had better use the basket, as we would present a better appearance if we did than if we attempted their mode of travel. So we lowered one by one to the ledge, then down to the little plateau just above the village. No sooner had the last one stepped from the basket than our friends were there. We went down to the village and spent the greater part of the day. It was a quaint old place, typical of those mountain districts with its houses built by digging into the side of the cliff, then closing up the opening with rock walls. There were in all about 20 of these houses. We were told that the houses were built in this manner to keep them from being crushed by the heavy snows in winter. The villagers soon began to gather, and Emile talked to them for a few moments. It was arranged that a meeting should be held the following afternoon, and couriers were to send out to notify those of the neighborhood who wished to attend. We were told that John the Baptist had lived at this village and received instruction in the temple, and that the temple remained the same as when John received this instruction there. We were shown where the house had been torn down. That afternoon, when we returned to the temple, the weather had cleared so that we could see a wide expanse of country, and we were shown the trail that John had used in going to and from the temple and the different villages where he lived. The temple was supposed to have been built and the village established more than 6,000 years before John visited there. We were shown the trail we would take when we departed, and we told the trail had been in use since the temple was built. About 5 o'clock that afternoon, our friend of the records said he would leave us for a time. He then shook hands, saying he would see us soon, and disappeared. That evening we saw the most remarkable sunset from the roof of the temple that I have ever witnessed, and it has been my good fortune to have seen sunsets in nearly all lands. As evening advanced, a light haze was gathering over a low range of mountains that bordered a wide expanse of tablelands which we could look down upon. When the sun reached this rim, we were seemingly so far above it that it appeared as if we were looking directly down upon a sea of molten gold. Then came the afterglow, and every mountain peak appeared to be aflame. Those in the distance that were covered with snow seemed to be blanketed with fire, and where glaciers filled the ravines, it appeared as though they were shooting forth great tongues of fire, and these flames appeared to meet and melt with the different hues in the heavens. The lakes that dotted the plain below were transformed suddenly into volcanoes, belching forth fires, which ascended and blended with the colors in the heavens. For one moment it seemed as if we were standing on the brink of a silent inferno. Then all blended into one harmony of color, and the soft, peaceful quiet was beyond description. We sat on the roof until after 12 that night, asking Emil and Jess questions. These questions pertained principally to the people and the history of the country in general. Emil quoted liberally from their records. These records proved that this country was inhabited thousands of years before our history began. Emil went on to say, while I do not in any way wish to disparage or make light of our history or of those who wrote it, I will say that at the beginning of this history, the historians did not go back far enough, but took for granted that Egypt meant what the name implied, outer darkness or the wilderness. It really meant the wilderness of thought. At that time, as now, a large portion of the world was in wilderness of thought, and they did not go back of it to get the deeper meaning. They accepted that they saw or heard or what appeared on the surface, recorded it, and their history began. It is quite difficult to correlate the two, and I would not attempt to say that you must take ours as authentic. I would suggest that you choose for yourselves. The moon then appeared over the far off mountains. We sat and watched it round and full until it rose nearly overhead. It was a beautiful sight, with an occasional light cloud passing by at an elevation just above us. When these clouds went drifting by, it seemed as if the moon and clouds were standing still and we were drifting past them. This went on for an hour, when suddenly there was a noise as of some object thrown to the roof behind us. We started to our feet and looked around. There stood a middle-aged lady, smiling and asking if she had startled us. Our first impression was that she had jumped from the parapet to the roof, but she had only stamped her foot to attract our attention. The stillness had been so intense we had greatly magnified the sound. Emil stepped forward quickly, greeted her, and introduced us to his sister. She smiled and asked whether she had intruded on our dreams. We then sat down, and in a short time the conversation drifted into reminiscences of her experiences. She has 3 sons and a daughter that had been raised in the work. She replied that the youngest 2 were always with her. We asked if we might see them. She replied that they could come there that evening, and immediately 2 figures, a man and a woman, appeared. They greeted their uncle and their mother, then came forward and were introduced to the 3 of us. The son was a tall, erect, manly fellow whom we took to be about 30 years of age. The daughter was not tall, rather slight, with very fine features. She was a fine, well poised girl, whom we judged about 20 years of age. Afterwards we found that the son was 115 and the daughter was 128 years old. They were all to be present at the meeting the next day, and soon went below. After they had retired, we passed complimentary remarks about the son and the daughter. The mother turned to us and said, "Every child born is good and perfect. There are no bad children. It does not matter whether they are conceived in a perfect or immaculate, or through the sense or material way. The one conceived in the perfect way will soon recognize his sonship with the Father, that he is the Christ or Son of God. Then he will develop and unfold quickly, and he will see only perfection. The one conceived through the sense way may also immediately recognize his sonship, perceive that the Christ is in him, and may realize his perfection by realizing the Christ. He gazes up on the ideal, loves and cherishes it until he manifests or brings forth that which he gazes upon, the Christ. He is reborn and is perfect. He has brought forth perfection from within himself. That perfection which was always there, the one held to the ideal and was perfect. The other perceived the ideal and unfolded that ideal and regained perfection. Thus no child is bad. All are good and from God. Here one of the parties suggested that it was bedtime, as it was past 12 o'clock. Chapter 19. 5 o'clock the next morning found us all assembled on the roof of the temple. After regular morning greetings, we gather around, and, as is the usual custom, the selection was read. The selection this morning was from the records of the temple. Jess translated them, and we were surprised to find that the translation closely corresponded to the first chapter of St. John in our Bible, and the second reading corresponded to the first chapter of Luke. After the reading, we asked if we might get our Bible and compare the versions. They readily consented, and with the assistance of Jess, we made the comparison and were surprised at the similarity. We had scarcely finished when the breakfast call sounded and all went in. After breakfast we prepared to descend to the village, and for the time the comparison left our minds. When we arrived we found quite a number of congregated from the near-by country, and were told by Jess that they were nearly all shepherds that pastured their flocks in the high mountains in summer, and the time for leaving the lower regions was fast approaching. We were told that such a meeting as would take place that afternoon was always called just before the people departed. As we walked through the village we met Emil's nephew, and he suggested we go for a short walk before lunch. We accepted the invitation readily, as we wished to see some of the country around. While we were on this walk, several places were pointed out in the valley as being of special interest. The names, when translated, very closely resembled those of the earlier Bible names. But the real significance of all this did not present itself until we had returned, had lunch, and were seated among those that had assembled. There were about 200 in this assembly when the rest of our friends from the temple appeared. Then Emil's nephew arose and approached two men holding what looked to us like a large book. When this was opened, it proved to be a box in the form of a book. He selected the package, which consisted of flat leaves like those of manuscript. Then the box was placed on the ground. The package was handed to one of the men. He opened it and handed the first leaf to Emil's nephew. When the reading of each leaf was finished, it was handed to the other man, who placed it in the box. The reading proceeded, with Jess as interpreter. It had not gone very far when we saw that it bore a striking resemblance to the book of St. John, carried out much more in detail. Then followed one similar to that of Luke, then one similar to that of Mark, and the final one was like that of Matthew. After the reading, the people collected in little groups, and we, with jest, sought Emil, for we were curious to know the meaning of it all. We were told that these records were read each year at the meeting, and that this place was the center of the country where these scenes were enacted long years ago. We remarked the similarity of these happenings with those chronicled in our Bible, and were told that there was no question but that some of the earlier scenes as chronicled in our Bible were taken from these records, but those happenings of a later date, such as the crucifixion, took place elsewhere, the whole reading its climax in the birth and life of Christ. The foremost thought of it all was the search for the Christ in man, and to show those who had wandered away from the ideal that the Christ lived in them as he always had. Emil went on to say, it does not matter where the scenes were enacted. It is the underlying spiritual significance which we wish to perpetuate. We spent the balance of the afternoon and the next day making comparisons and taking notes. Space will not permit the inclusion here of these notes and comparisons, but the spiritual meaning will be understood by reading these chapters mentioned above. We found that the father of Emil's nephew, who read the records to us, was born in the village, was a direct descendant of John, and that it was the custom of some member of the family to come to this place at this time and read these records. The temple above us was the one where Zacharias and John both had worshipped. We found that our friends wished to be on their way, so it was arranged that Jess would stay with us and the others would go on. We finished with the records the next day, then left the temple early in the morning after. Although the hour was early, nearly all the villagers were up to bid us Godspeed. Chapter 20. The next 5 days our trail led us through the country that John had traveled. The fifth day brought us to the village where our horses were waiting for us. Here Emil met us, and from this time on the traveling was comparatively easy to the village where Emil lived. As we neared this village, we could see that the country was more thickly populated, and the roads and trails were far better than any we had traveled. Our way led along the fertile valley, and we were following this valley to what happened to be the level plateau. We noticed that the valley was gradually getting narrower as we went on, and at last the walls came in so close on each side of the stream that they formed a canyon. About 4 o'clock of that day we reached the village. We came suddenly to a perpendicular bluff over which the stream fell in a drop of about 300 feet. The road led to the level place at the foot of the cliff near the falls. We found that there was an opening cut in the sandstone on an angle of 45 degrees to the plateau above, and steps had been hewn in the floor of the upraised so that the ascent was an easy one. Great stone doors had been so arranged that they could be closed in the opening at the foot of the cliff, thus presenting a formidable barrier to an intruding foe. When we reached the plateau above, we found the stairway up the incline was the only means of egress or ingress that the creek afforded. At one time there had been three means of access, but the walls that were surrounded the village had now been rebuilt in such a way as to bar all possible access. A great many houses in the village were built so that one wall formed a part of the wall that surrounded the village. We noted that when the houses formed part of the wall, these houses were usually 3 stories high, and there were no openings for windows in the wall until the third story was reached. At every opening a balcony was built large enough for 2 or 3 people to stand up on comfortably. These, we judged, were arranged so that a lookout could be kept at all times. We were told the district was once inhabited by a native tribe that isolated themselves from the others, until as a tribe they had disappeared. A few have been assimilated by the other tribes. This was Emil's home and the place where we were to meet the members of our party, who had divided into small groups in order to cover more territory. Upon inquiry, we found we were the first to arrive and that the others would be in the next day. We were assigned to one of the houses built into the wall of the village. The windows of the third story looked out over the rugged mountainous country to the south. We were made comfortable and were told that supper would be served on the first or ground floor. We went down and found Emil, his sister, her husband, and the son and daughter that we had met at the temple a few days before, seated at the table. We had no sooner finished supper than we heard a commotion in the little square which the house faced. One of the villagers came in and announced that our chief and his party had arrived. They were made comfortable. Then we all proceeded to the roof. The sun had gone down, but the afterglow still lingered. The view we looked out upon resembled a large basin at the confluence of a number of streams coming down in deep gorges from the higher mountains. These streams all entered the large stream before it flowed over the steep wall of rocks into the valley below, thus forming the waterfall. This larger stream emerged from the deep canyon and ran over the level plateau, but a few hundred feet before it plunged over the precipice. A number of smaller streams flow over the perpendicular walls of the canyon cut by the larger stream, forming perpendicular falls, and in some cases roaring torrents. Some fell in sheer drops of 1 to 200 feet, while others had cut their way into the canyon wall and fell in a succession of cataracts. Far up in the mountains the gorges were filled with glaciers, and these glaciers projected like giant fingers from the great snow cap that covered the top of the entire range. The wall to protect the village had been joined to that of the larger gorge, where it jutted out up on the level plain, then ran down and out to the cliff where the water dropped into the valley below. Where this wall joined the wall of the gorge, the mountain rose perpendicular for 2,000 feet, thus creating a natural barrier as far as the eye could see. We were told that the level plateau extended for 60 miles east and west, and in some places was 30 miles north and south, and the only other means of access was at the widest part of the plateau where the trail led over the pass, and this pass was guarded by a wall similar to one where we were. While we were talking over the advantages of the location for defense, Emil's sister and her daughter joined us, and a little later Emil. His sister, husband, and son came up. We noticed an undercurrent of excitement. and were soon told by amused sister that they expected a visit from their mother that evening. She said, "We are so happy that we can hardly contain ourselves, for we do love mother so. We love all that have gone on to the higher attainments very dearly, for they are so fine and noble and helpful. But our own mother is so sweet and adorable, so helpful and loving. We cannot help loving her 1,000 times more. Besides, we are of her flesh and blood. We know you will love her as we do." We asked whether she came often. The reply was, "Oh, yes, she always comes when we needed her, but she is so taken up with her work that she comes only twice a year of her own accord, and this is one of her semi-annual visits. She is to stay a week this time, and we are all so happy we scarcely know what to do." Here the talk drifted into experience of our own associates while we were separated, and we were deep in this discussion when suddenly stillness came over all, and almost before we realized it, we were sitting perfectly silent, without a suggestion from anyone. The evening shadows had gathered until the far-off mountain snow-cap looked like a great white monster just ready to loose its icy fingers and reach out over the valley below. From the stillness came a gentle swish, like that of a bird alighting, and it seemed as though a slight mist were gathering on the eastern parapet. The mist suddenly took form, and there stood a woman, wondrously beautiful in face and form, with an intense radiant light about her that we could scarcely look upon. The family started to their feet and advanced rapidly toward her with outstretched arms, exclaiming, "Mother!" almost as one voice. She stepped slightly down from the parapet to the roof and embraced each as any fond mother would, then was introduced to us. She said, "Oh, you are dear brothers from far away America that have come to visit us. I certainly am overjoyed to welcome you to our land. Our hearts go out to all, and we feel that if they would only let us, we would just put our arms out and embrace all as I have embraced these I call mine just now. For we are in reality one family, sons of the one Father, Mother God. Why can we not all meet as brothers?" We had remarked just before that the evenings were growing chilly, but when this lady appeared the warmth emitted from her presence made the evening seem like that of midsummer. The air seemed laden with the perfume of flowers. A light like that of the full moon seemed to pervade everything, and there was a warmth and glow over all that I cannot describe. Yet there was no hint of display, just that deep, simple, kindly, childlike way. It was suggested that we go below, and the mother with the other ladies led the way to the stairs, with our party following, and the men of the household bringing up the rear. Then we noticed that although we seemed to be walking in the usual way, our feet made no sound upon the roof or the stairs. We were not trying to go quietly. In fact, one of our party said he deliberately tried to make a noise and could not. It did not seem as if our feet came in contact with the roof or stairs. We went into the beautiful furnished room. As soon as we entered and were seated, we noticed a warmth and glow, and the room was filled with a soft light that none of us could explain. All maintained a deep silence for a time. The mother asked if we were comfortably located and cared for, and if we were enjoying our trip. The talk led to general everyday subjects, and she seemed familiar with them all. The talk then led to our home life, and the mother gave us the given names of fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers, and we were surprised at the detailed descriptions of each of our lives that she gave without asking us one question. She told us the countries we had visited, the work we had accomplished, and where we had failed. This was not told in a vague way that we would be obliged to piece together, but every detail stood out as plainly as if we were living the scenes over again. After our friends bade us good night, we could but wonder when we realized that not one of them was less than 100 years old, and the mother was over 700 years, and 600 of that time she had lived on earth and with her physical body, yet all were as buoyant and light-hearted as though they had been 20 and nothing was assumed. It was as though youthful people were with us. Before they departed that evening, we were told there would be quite an assembly in the lodge the next evening, and that we were all invited to be present. End of chapter 20.